Make-believe smoke and mirrors. In 2014, a video appeared on YouTube entitled Make-believe smoke and mirrors. I discovered this video in 2018 quite by accident in my usual searching activities on the internet. Remember, with well over 7 million hits for the Google search phrase moon hoax, then there are undoubtedly videos which I have not yet discovered. I promise to keep reading. The video, posted anonymously, purports to explain in considerable detail exactly how NASA X-faked the Apollo moon landing videos. What surprised me the most was that the small number of views the video had when I first discovered it, only about 200, which for a video on YouTube for 3 years is surprisingly few. I could post a video of my postman delivering letters and get more views in an afternoon. I cannot confirm whether this video was genuine or merely some extremely elaborate hoax, but elaborate it is. It would have taken a considerable amount of time, technical knowledge, and some significant effort to produce, given that the video is over 2 hours and 44 minutes long. Whatever the truth or the matter, the video makes compelling viewing. The video, Make-Believe Smoke and Mirrors, is now available totally restored with audio and commentary on the Apollo Detectives and on the ApolloMoonHoax.net website. NASA Apollo astronauts never actually set foot on the moon, so how did NASA X manage to produce the video evidence that fooled the world, and still does most people? We need to remember that we are back in the 1960s. It was a time long before computers with any real processing power or digital photographs or computer-generated images were available. Fooling the world's population with videos from the moon must have represented quite a daunting challenge for NASA X. They had certain aspects in their favor. Nobody had any concept of what the moon really looked like close up, and the general public only had minimal knowledge of the science involved. Many of the pro-NASA fan club members claimed that it would be more difficult to fake the moon landings than it would to have sent astronauts to the moon. Some pro-NASA devotees even go as far as to state that it would be impossible to fake the moon landings in the 1960s. Perhaps going to the moon was not a feasible alternative for NASA, so appearing to go to the moon may have been the next best thing. No doubt the risk of failure or killing the astronauts must have been a real consideration. Nowadays, it would be relatively easy with powerful computers and digital images to fake any journey into space, but hopefully, we have more powerful fake detection abilities. For example, take a look at this video, but before you view the video, I can tell you that it is totally fake, what they now call a deepfake. A deepfake is a computer technique that is in its most basic form a person in an existing image or a video is replaced with the likeness of someone else, or a new voiceover added to a person in an existing video, or, even more extreme, the whole video is manufactured by sophisticated software manipulating old video and audio. This video shows what might have happened if the Apollo 11 mission had resulted in tragedy. At first viewing, it is easy to believe that it is real. With the rapid advancement of computer imaging, it will not be long before fakery becomes virtually undetectable. The original YouTube post of Make-Believe Smoke and Mirrors disappeared suddenly 4 months after I first discovered it. We are fortunate that now we have a well-narrated version of the original Make-Believe Smoke and Mirrors video thanks to a sterling efforts by my friend Bob Williams. Bob is a Canadian filmmaker, and he has added an excellent commentary which replaces the original version that has the disguised voice narration. It makes the video so much easier to follow and understand. He has also divided the original video, which lasts 2 hours and 44 minutes, into 5 separate videos of about 30 minutes each. This link gives the complete remastered video, which is available on the Apollo Detectives and on ApolloMoonHoax.net. In the first video, he starts by describing how you can access the Apollo movie clips. Knowing how to access the official NASA Apollo movie clips is crucial if you want to check any of the footage yourself. He then describes how you can identify the clips he uses. He follows with a description of the time change factors used in the NASA videos. In total, he identifies and lists 7 different frame extraction sequences which were used by NASA. He uses this to calculate the frame adjustment factors needed to remove the slow motion from the NASA footage. The equation he derives is 24 frames per second divided by slow motion frames per second equals frame length adjustment factor. For completeness, I will list all 7 factor changes as shown in the video. Each factor change is used in specific applications as described. He notes that there may well be other speed change factors used that he has not identified. He also comments on the instances where the astronauts appear to stumble and then regain their balance. Some of these sequences look quite odd, but he says that this is because the astronauts were suspended by a harness attached to a single counterbalance wire. Their attempts to regain control of their balance are affected by the tautness of the suspension wire. Often, you can see them appear to undergo spasms in their movement in an attempt to recover their balance, which looks very unnatural. He also describes how you can identify the clips he uses. He follows with a description of the time change factors used in the NASA videos. In total, he identifies and lists 7 different frame extraction sequences which were used by NASA. He uses this to calculate the frame adjustment factors needed to remove the slow motion from the NASA footage. Initially, I found this aspect hard to understand. If all the videos were filmed at 144 frames per second as he states, and the slow motion added later using the optical printer, then how could the counterweights have been adjusted at the time of filming? I now see that it is the film rates that have been adjusted using the optical printer to the counterbalance wires used in the filming. I think that it is the list that threw me off. I trust I am correct. No doubt, some overzealous troll with far too much time on their hands may correct me if I am not. He further discusses the video sequences of the lunar rover. He concludes that when the appropriate speed factor for the particular video sequence is applied, then the lunar rover looks the same as it would when driving on Earth. Now, the real reveal. The narrator refers to John Dykstra, the mastermind behind the Star Wars movie. He states that Dykstra trained under the mastermind of the Apollo footage, who he claims to be Doug Trumbull. What do we know about Douglas Trumbull? Wikipedia states, Douglas Huntley Trumbull is an American film director, special effects supervisor, and inventor. He contributed to, or was responsible for, the special optical effects of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Blade Runner, and The Tree of Life, and directed the movies Silent Running and Brainstorm. He goes on to discuss the use NASA X made of accurate moonscapes and tracking cameras, ostensibly as simulators to train the astronauts. These simulators could then have been used to capture the real Apollo footage, particularly for the fake lunar orbits and moon landing sequences. Finally, he talks about the very few people in NASA X involved in the hoax, the astronauts, cameramen, DIA operatives, and a few of the staff in mission control. All others firmly believed that they were witnessing and controlling the actual event, and each was tending to their specific data feed, whatever that may have been for each individual. A crucial part of this process was the fact that no other astronauts, backup crew, or support crew members were allowed to communicate directly with the astronauts on the mission. NASA stated that this was necessary because a trained astronaut was the best able to understand any situation occurring during the mission. They could then pass on any information most clearly. According to NASA, this was a crucial safety feature. At first glance, this makes eminent sense. However, it formed one of the most crucial aspects of the hoax and entirely necessary to avoid detection. I did warn you that this is a complex analysis, as we shall see when we examine the details in the following sections. Rainbow motion blur. NASA X employed a technique known as rainbow motion blur, using a rotating disc of red, blue, and green filters immediately in front of the camera lens. The faster the object moves, then the more we see of the rainbow motion blur. The cameras used on Apollo had these color filters fitted. The addition to the camera was to create that out-of-this-world effect. It also partially hid the details of the scenery and the action of the astronauts. You can observe the rainbow motion blur in many of the earlier Apollo videos. This rainbow motion blur that you can see in the early NASA moon videos is irrefutable proof of the deceit. The cameras used on the moon could not have created this rainbow motion blur effect without the addition of this revolving filter. The simplicity of the lunar landscape, with no vegetation, no water, and hence no erosion, made the reproduction of a convincing moonscape relatively straightforward. If you can only invent a reason not to see the stars, then, well, you are on your way to faking it. Just imagine how much more difficult it would have been to fake a landing on Earth with all of its complexity of scenery and skies. The rainbow effect also gave the footage a shimmery, otherworldly look to the NASA footage. This helped to place it on the moon. The first transmission of the Apollo 11 on the moon was almost ghost-like. This effect was a result of the colored banding referred to by Jet Windsor in this acclaimed movie, Moon Hoax Now. It is also suggested that an array of color lenses was used to slightly distort the image and disorientate the viewer into believing it came from another planet. It also had the effect of making things appear farther away than they were, so falsely enlarging the scene. It also helped to disguise the frame per second technique, which we will discuss next. Remember that if NASA X did fake the lunar missions, then they needed to be slightly tentative with the first transmissions on Apollo 11. If they passed Apollo 11 off as successful, and they did, then they could use the improved image quality on future missions. The narrator discusses the motion blur effect and looks at the various types used in the old analog TV transmission. NASA X used the rainbow motion blur effect extensively. The more rainbow color blur occurs, the faster an object or camera moves. This rainbow motion blur gave the scene a ghostly effect coupled with the simultaneous use of a curved lens which greatly exaggerated distances. It also gave the impression that there was more depth to the set than was actual. Frames per second! Frames per second was a crucial aspect of the hoax, and we need to understand it. A slow-motion master at 144 frames per second was captured of the astronauts performing their tasks on an Earth-based lunar set. Often, the astronauts were suspended from a single counterbalanced wire, although not always. An optical printer was then employed to generate this 144 frames per second master various slow-motion speeds. The closer the camera was to the astronaut performers, the less extreme the slow motion used. When the astronauts moved away from the camera, then more slow motion was introduced. Any detailed close-up action used much less slow motion, say when the astronauts were using their fingers to handle objects close to the camera. Too much slow motion for the close-up events would have revealed the fakery. You may be wondering why, as I was, if NASA X wanted to slow down motion, for example, of falling objects to simulate the lesser moon gravity, then why did they need slow motion filming? Well, it transpires that the answer is simple. Take for example a film speed of let's say 28 frames per second, and you wanted to mischievously slow down a falling object which takes 1 second to fall in Earth's gravity. To simulate a different gravity, say you need to take it 4 frames per second to fall. You could slowly run the 28 frames to cover the 4 seconds, but then you would only have a miserly 7 frames per second, which would look noticeably jerky. The above figures are given to illustrate purposes only to make the maths simple. So the answer is to use slow motion, say 144 frames per second, to capture the scene, then play it back over 4 seconds. In this case, you would still have the 144 frames divided by 4 seconds. That is still a healthy 36 frames per second, which would look completely natural. As we have already mentioned, each section of video may include several different slow-motion segments. The only disadvantage to shooting at high frame rates is that considerably more light is needed as there is less time to expose each frame, but if you are cheating here on Earth, then providing more light intensity is not a problem. Many of our skeptics have shown that additional light sources were employed. The original 16mm 144 frames per second film was processed on the optical printer. The camera is pointed at the optical projector and exposed 1 frame at a time and either recorded onto a new film or discarded as necessary. The optical projector is an amazingly powerful but simple film visual effects production process perfect for faking the hoax Apollo moon footage. With a projection into the optical printer, you can capture whatever frames you wish, a sort of mix and match process to achieve the desired result. This technique of dropping skipping frames, repeating or jumping back a frame or two, or freezing frames for an instant, all of which caused the stuttering look seen on many NASA moon videos, was probably the crucial weapon of disguise. It is often extremely effective at disguising the slow motion. NASA employed these methods a lot, but not all the time. You can see how the optical printer is used to sequence a film in this short video. We have already mentioned using curved lenses to give the illusion that the stage set had more depth. The use of different frame rates, i.e. levels of slow motion, was also quite ingenious. Different frame rates were employed extensively to falsify or add depth to the scenery by tricking the eye. They did this by changing the amount of slow motion used depending upon what was happening on the set. The closer the astronaut was to the camera, then the amount of slow motion was much reduced. For example, when the astronauts were manipulating objects very close to the camera, then the slow motion was reduced perhaps only 10%. As the astronaut moves further away from the camera, then the amount of slow motion was increased in stages. The time it takes for the astronaut to move away is thus falsely increased. These changes of slow motion rate gave the illusion that the stage set had greater depth. A prime example of this use of slow motion change is revealed in this short clip from Apollo 14 during the LSEP offload procedure. It was originally the MP4 file A14V.11523334 in the Apollo 14 video library. Carefully watch the video, and at elapsed time 5 seconds, you can see the speed change as the astronaut slows down unnaturally. This sequence is a prime example of the frame speed changing as more slow motion is increased as the astronaut moves further away from the camera. Note that this revealing video has been removed from the NASA archive and is no longer available. This video has been replaced with a new version. Interestingly, what was clear evidence of the frame speed change has been superstitiously eliminated. This substitution is just another example of NASA editing the evidence that revealed the techniques of the fakery. Gravity analysis of falling objects. Falling sand would prove to be a problem when it was happening simultaneously with a falling astronaut who was assisted by a counterbalanced wire. This aspect is one of the most persuasive elements of the deceit. In the make-believe video, an astronaut graph is set up showing the number of frames anything falling from the respective height would take. The red graph is for the moon and the blue graph is for the Earth. The number of frames etched onto this graph is slightly hard to read, but the marks represent seconds. When watching this video, you need to concentrate on the 3 series of numbers displayed on the right-hand side of the screen for each clip analyzed. Each series gives the start frame number and the end frame number and the difference, i.e. the number of frames for the fall. The first set of numbers at the top shows the number of frames that the sand fell in the raw Apollo footage. A red total indicates that the number is inconsistent with the gravity on the moon. The second set of numbers shows the number of frames that the sand fell in the Apollo footage adjusted to be accurate with the moon gravity, i.e. the red numbers on the astronaut scale. The third set of numbers shows the number of frames the sand fell for in the retimed Apollo footage, which is adjusted to represent the gravity on the Earth. He then examines all of the NASA videos in which the falling sand can be distinctly observed. As you can imagine, there are numerous such instances in the 6 alleged NASA moon missions. He is only able to analyze those clips in which he can definitely identify the start and the end of the falling sand. He is not able to do this for all instances. Even so, he can do it for a total of 66 of the video clips showing falling sand. Note that all such clips came from the Apollo missions 15, 16, and 17. In every scene that he analyzed, he demonstrates that it was not recorded in lunar gravity, but in Earth's gravity. This analysis shows conclusively that the sequences were filmed on Earth and is a shattering result for the Apollo moon mission believers. We discussed the technique of speed changes events above, so now he looks at examples where it was employed. He states that the film speed in frames per second was changed often mid-scene, usually, but not always, when astronauts were not on the scene or had just made the jump as they were walking or some other distracting movement. Whenever an astronaut came close to the camera, the amount of slow motion was reduced, otherwise it would have looked unrealistic. It was employed often in the case when the astronauts were doing something close up with their hands. These frame rate changes were necessary to give the footage a consistent look. He noticed that they often sped up the motion as the astronaut approached the camera, but does not understand why they did this. Perhaps it was to explain the quick closing approach and give an impression of distance. He shows several examples of how the speed factor change was employed. NASA X used this technique constantly throughout the videos. This technique is interesting in that some skeptics have incorrectly claimed that the Apollo footage was simply slowed down for some fixed factor to reproduce lunar gravity. This assumption has been seized upon by the pro-NASA group to disprove that the Apollo videos were Earth videos slowed down to simulate lunar gravity. They have produced video after video in which the video is slowed down often with hilarious results. This is because several different slow-motion segments may have been used to create one video sequence. Perhaps of equal importance is that the slowing down technique does not take into account the fact that the astronauts were often assisted by counterbalanced wires. We will see several examples of this being used by the pro-NASA group in Video 8, The Harbingers of Deceit. In the first part of this section, the narrator provides an overview of the astronauts' moon suit and the training they did while using counterbalanced wires to simulate lunar gravity. In the second half of this section, he compares the actions of the astronauts in the moon footage to that in the Apollo training footage. He deduces from this comparison that the supposition that the astronauts were suspended by a single counterbalanced wire was indeed correct. He emphasizes the extraordinary ability of the astronauts shown in the training videos to perform quite athletic movements, jumping very high and even performing high somersaults with little apparent effort. He notes that none of these athletic performances was ever seen in the Apollo moon footage. The wire used was probably a single braided monofilament of no more than 5 mm diameter, which was not usually visible on the Apollo cameras but was observable on some rare occasions. The training videos also showed astronauts using a pressure suit, and the differences between the unpressured suit and the pressurized suit are vast. He shows an example of the astronaut training in pressurized suits both in Earth gravity and in simulated lunar gravity. It is clear that in the simulated lunar gravity condition, the astronaut has problems in obtaining friction in his feet due to the 83.3% of his weight being taken up by counterbalanced wires. The amount of friction is the direct function of the weight of the astronaut and the roughness of the surface. This friction loss is an aspect discussed by Steve the Chemist in his Physics of the Apollo Moonwalk video. Further on, the narrator identifies several actions by the astronauts that led him to conclude that they were suspended on a single wire attached between the astronaut's body and his backpack. This wire had counterbalance for the specific body weight of the astronaut and the desired frame rate. You can observe many unnatural physical movements made by the astronauts in the Apollo footage. Sometimes you can see the backpack is being pulled up as the astronaut bends forward. The presence of the wire also caused the astronauts to lean on it for support. Occasionally, they had sudden spasms induced by the wire going slack, which causes them to have full body jerks to regain their balance. These instances are common if you carefully watch the footage of the astronaut moving. He shows how he calculated the specific counterbalance weight the astronaut needed for each of the several frames per second film speeds to simulate lunar gravity. If you are interested in the maths, then I suggest you study this video. This section ends with many examples of strange movements exhibited by the astronauts. These strange movements result from the tension in the wire and the sudden spasms when the astronaut felt the wire tension lessen. He shows clear examples of the backpack being pulled upwards by the wire as the astronaut leans forward. He notes that in many sequences, the astronauts appear to be like puppets on a string, as shown in this amusing video by Daniela. Slow motion. In this section, the narrator examines in more detail the use of slow motion. He does not doubt that the slow motion is used extensively, if not entirely, in the Apollo footage. It was used to create a moon-like scenario and account for the lesser gravity that the astronauts were supposedly experiencing. It has been incorrectly suggested by some skeptics that the action was filmed on Earth and then the film projected in slow motion to simulate lunar gravity. Various suggestions have been made for the rate of slow motion. Many have guessed that it was about 60%. This great trick of NASA X was that the slow motion rate was varied from second to second depending on the action. It has therefore been relatively easy for the pro-Apollo group to counter such claims made by the skeptics. If a single speed factor is applied to the Apollo footage, then the action can appear completely unrealistic, so basically disproving any such claims. It is only when the correct speed factors are applied for each separate action, such as running, walking, hopping, jogging, and recovering from spasms, that the action looks as though it is in Earth's gravity. This section shows many of the slow motion clips. The narrator notes the extraordinary amount of hopping and jogging performed by the astronauts ostensibly to create the sense of a lesser lunar gravity. Given that these antics were supposedly being performed in an extremely dangerous environment, it is genuinely surprising to observe such foolishness. One fall could result in a torn spacesuit, followed by a sudden, presumably painful death. He states that the NASA footage is obviously in slow motion, and anyone who denies this is just fooling themselves. To illustrate his point, he shows the same clips in the original NASA slow motion, and then looks with the slow motion removed when the performers look like normal humans walking in spacesuits on the Earth. The walking can look a little odd, as large portions of their weight is supported by the counterbalance wire, and often their movements are severely restrained by the wire. He notes that one trick that NASA used and that the camera is seldom still. It is constantly moving to keep the viewer busy to distract from the detail of what is going on. When your attention is specifically directed onto what is actually happening, then the movements of the astronauts can be farcical. He directs your attention to those instances in which the astronauts stumble and then need to catch their balance. He notes that we human beings have an instinct to react quickly to any temporary loss of balance to prevent ourselves falling. This reaction is quite apparent in the factor-adjusted video, but somewhat less obvious in the NASA slow-motion video. When supported by the counterbalanced wire, the astronauts do not have complete control of their movements. In many situations, the astronauts appear to be severely restricted by the effects of their supporting wire. This lack of control often makes their actions look jerky and somewhat abnormal. He shows clear examples of the astronaut being pulled off balance suddenly by the supporting wire, and I imagine totally unexpected for the astronaut. Film gauges. In this section, he discusses how the alleged live TV broadcasts were captured on 16mm film and then transferred to video for transmission. He offers the idea that a fiber optic system was used, which helps to explain the extreme lens distortion seen in much of the Apollo footage. He discusses the film gauges, film sizes used, and notes that several gauges were used from 16mm, 35mm, 70mm, and possibly others. He shows that you can use a small format, say 16mm film gauge, to capture the action and then use an optical printer to create large formats, but still with an acceptable resolution. A loss in the video resolution in the Apollo footage was not a disadvantage, as it only assisted in the illusion that they were watching the action on the moon a great distance away. The pro-NASA group have said that there is no way that the hoax could have used slow-motion video because of the amount of footage needed and the limitations of the cameras used. He suggests a simpler answer, and he explains how the fiber optic system, together with the 16mm reel reload opportunities to render any footage limitations a non-issue. The stage set. If NASA X were to create a complete faked stage set on which to film the Apollo footage, then they needed to have realistic topographical detail of the landing sites to be convincing. They did have a wealth of satellite imagery collected from satellites launched in 1966-67 to photograph the moon for that very reason. They used this detailed image data to create training sets here on Earth. NASA then constructed large-scale models of the moon and more accurately detailed models of particular areas, notably the planned Apollo landing sites, to familiarize and train astronauts. NASA even used explosives to construct a full-scale model of an area of the moon at Cinder Lake in Arizona. This is still visible on Google Earth, but now very much diminished due to being used by off-roaders. The success of the hoax depended upon the accuracy of these models. He estimates that the stage set was circular and quite sizable, perhaps up to 300 meters in diameter. The stage set was completely surrounded by a wall onto which the mountain detail was painted or projected using the front screen projection technique. He also suggests that there may have been more than one stage set used of various sizes. The main contours of the stage set were probably created using wooden formwork. This formwork was then overlaid with sand, to which a small amount of oil had been added, and finally some rocks were scattered to add the final detail. The simplicity of the moon's scenery, with no vegetation, no water to cause any erosion, and no color more than shades of gray, greatly simplified the possibility to achieve a realistic look. After all, nobody knew what the moon looked like close up, so all they needed to achieve was something which resembled the photographs obtained from the lunar orbiters, and as a tentative beginning, some purposefully blurred video, particularly on the first Apollo 11 mission. The narrator then describes how he supposes that they used a stage set and the projected background scenery to create the illusion of the moonscape. He compares the technique used to that employed in Cinerama in the 1960s, which was utilized extensively by Douglas Trumbull in several of his movies. They had two major problems to overcome. The first was the interference between the real foreground stage set and the projected image or painted background. You will see in virtually all of the Apollo footage that they never really solved this interference problem. You can always detect a continuous line separating the foreground stage set and the fake background. This visible anomaly has been commented upon by almost all skeptics and mostly ignored by the pro-NASA crowd. The second problem was the nature of the sand. Unlike soil on the Earth where we have erosion, the sand particles on the Moon are not rounded and do not roll against each other, but would most probably leave a distinct impression for boot prints and tire tracks. They also had the problem of dust clouds forming as the finer particles in the sand are momentarily suspended in the atmosphere. There is no atmosphere on the Moon, so any inkling of dust clouds had to be eliminated. They solved this problem by adding a small amount of oil to the sand to produce better cohesion to mimic how they thought the lunar sand would behave. In most of the NASA moon footage, you can see that the spacesuits often had the fake moon dust adhere to them, particularly to the legs, arms, and hands. The astronauts were unable to dust this off as it was composed of normal sand plus a small amount of oil, which made it sticky. It would have required a detergent to remove the oil. NASA explained this stickiness was because lunar sand is jagged and easily clumps together, unlike Earth sand, which is rounded and does not stick but rolls away. He says that only a small amount of oil is required to produce the simulated moon sand. He claims to have carried this out on his own experiment with sand and a small quantity of cooking oil. When this mixture is distributed, it does not produce a dust cloud. One big giveaway was that there was something rather strange about this moon sand is that it also adhered to metal machinery as you see in the NASA moon footage.